a PhD in biology. I know I'm in progress. He holds a PhD in biology from the University of South Florida, a Master of Science in Marine Biology from Florida Institute of Technology, and a Bachelor of Science in Biology from Old Dominion University. He is also the first ever SBEP program scientist, and I'm hoping he explains what that is. I have no idea. And I've just been told he has just received an award as climate champion for Southwest Florida.
Yeah.
So congratulations.
Appreciate it. I get to compete against someone who's going to talk about Lyme disease and ticks, which is pretty cool. In case anyone doesn't know, Lyme disease is not restricted to Connecticut. It is in Florida. Hey, how's it going? We have members of our CAC here. And actually, it is really serious. I had a former person who worked for me who had Lyme disease. It was undiagnosed because they didn't think it would happen in Florida. And this person's health was severely compromised for like a decade. So it's a really, it's a bad disease. Good thing to learn about, like how to keep yourself from getting it. So without any further ado, SBEP stands for Sarasota Bay Estuary Program. We are one of 28 programs across the country in what's called the National Estuary Program. We're a special independent district like Disney or the Villages or the Daytona Speedway. So we're kind of like a state agency with 5 people. We have an elected board of policy board, including Commissioner Mike Haycock here, and also representatives from Sarasota County, Manatee County, City of Sarasota, Bradenton, and Water Management District, DEP, and EPA. Non-regulatory. Our funding is basically local governments, thank you, Mike, and also the federal government. About 75% of our money comes from the federal government. So we're not regulatory, so what do? What we try to do is we try to develop a science-based, locally developed management plan and try to help people understand the things that are stressing Sarasota Bay and the things that should be done to improve the health of Sarasota Bay. And the good news is we've got a pretty neat story to tell here. And a large part of it is because the local government's stepping up and doing the right sort of things to help us move forward. So without further ado, let me get going. So I don't talk about water chemistry and fish and crabs and shrimp first. We talk about quality of life, because this is what people do in our bay. They like to go out and take their boat out, throw an anchor in the water and stand around in waist deep water. And they want to be able to look down and see their feet. And they don't want to have rafts of macroalgae wrapping around themselves, their kids, or their grandkids. And I think if you live too close to this area, and you know where this is, right? Maybe that would be irritating. But nonetheless, this is what a lot of people do. This is in the New Pass area to the south. But our number one goal in Sarasota Bay is water clarity, to maximize water clarity the best it can be for that particular part of the bay. A clean bay is also important for our economy. There's 20,000 jobs associated with bay-related activities. The commercial fishing village of Cortez, there are not very many of those left in Florida. But there is one right here, and it's a pretty thriving little place. And if you've been there recently, you know the commercial fishing fleet coexists with waterfront restaurants and condos across the street. So it can be done. Working waterfronts can preserve, but there's not a lot of them left. Also recreational fishing guides and the waiters and waitresses and bartenders and the people who rent out jet skis and the restaurant owners. So 20,000 jobs. There's also a property value uplift of about $4 billion. People pay more to live on the water than across the street, and more across the street than a block away, that sort of thing. When you total that up, that's $4 billion. So that's how we pay for things like our police and fire and public schools, and paying for our program. So in case you didn't know this, Longboat Key produces more tax revenue for Manatee County than City of Bradenton. So we want to have people in Longboat Key want to continue to live here because they're paying the vast majority of the costs for things like, maintaining our healthy bays. And also we know that property values dip about 20 to 30% during a red tide up to a mile inland compared to adjacent counties that aren't experiencing red tide. And with red tide, we don't cause red tide, we cause it to be worse. We make red tides worse by fueling red tides to become larger, longer lasting, and more intense by nutrient loads. Number one source of nutrient loads that make red tides worse is Coosatchee River. And right now, Lake Okeechobee is being discharged to the east and west. So if we do have red tide organism, Corynea brevis, come near the shore, it's going to be a bigger, worse red tide than it would have been without human influence. All right. The next thing we talk about is habitats that depend upon water quality. So before we get too far, we want to make sure people understand these are seagrass meadows. They grow in the bottom of the bay. If you live here long enough, you know that. But if you've just moved here, you may not know that. They live on the bottom of the bay. Off to the other side are mangroves. They're all important habitat for fish and crabs and shrimp. They do a lot of good things for us. But seagrass meadows are a good indicator of the health of the bay because if the water is turbid, or if the water is green, if the water clarity isn't good, if you can't see your feet in waist deep water, then the seagrass isn't going to be able to grow. And if that's the case, you're going to have a lot of problems because we have habitat that is important for our wildlife, such as seagrass meadows. So I show this picture because it's the cutest thing in the world. And people look at it and they're like, oh my God, I want that child. But why would you bottle feed baby manatees? Well, these baby manatees being bottle fed because their moms died and they starved to death. And they starved to death over on the east coast of Florida, where we have lost probably half the manatee population the last 3 years. Statewide, we're down 20, 30%. Over on the east coast, it's about 50%. Brevard County is the epicenter of this unprecedented die-off of manatees we've had in the last 3 years. Because of degraded water quality, because of the degraded water quality, the seagrass meadows have retreated, and there's about 95% less food for manatees. The first year was brutal on mothers that were basically, feeding their mammals, so they breastfeed their young. It was particularly tough on mothers at that time, which is really hard because these manatees, maybe we save their lives, but we release them into the wild, they don't know how to be manatees. They've lost their guide. This is a matriarchal society. Elephants learn how to be elephants by following the older females. Manatees learn how to live as a manatee by following their moms, and their moms are dead. So this is a tough thing. We may not have lost these manatees, but they don't know how to be a manatee. So the population hit is actually going to be bigger than simply the number that have died. So if we don't want that to happen, and we don't, then we have to manage nutrients. So this graphic actually comes from the University of Maryland. If you want your lawn to be green, add nitrogen fertilizer. If you want your citrus tree to grow quickly, add nitrogen fertilizer. So if you want your bay to be green, or if you want algae to grow quicker, add nitrogen fertilizer. But you don't want that. So it's all about nitrogen management. Where does it come from? How do we reduce it? And how do we figure out how much we need to do? So in this graphic, nutrient loads increase, water clarity decreases. This would be an area that's too clean for Sarasota Bay. So think like the dried tortugas, or like the outer Exuma Islands in the Bahamas, where it's not what we think Sarasota should be like. But on the far right-hand side would be like Indian or Laguna. And that's not what we want to be either. We want to be right in the middle. We want to be the healthiest version of Sarasota Bay. So the only thing you have to report on is phytoplankton. So the only thing you have to do to talk about how healthy Sarasota Bay is dip a water bottle into the bay. But that's not how you determine how healthy a bay is, because all these things are important. So ourselves and our partners collect data on everything. We sample the water column every month at numerous locations. We have people who map out seagrasses. We have people that actually monitor the fish populations. And then we have volunteers that go out, and some of them are here right now, actually go and collect the amount of macroalgae that's growing in Sarasota Bay. So we include all this information, and we use it to come up with a report card for how is the bay doing, because that's the most important thing. How is the bay doing? So we have to be able to have a way to quantify that. So we have this report card, and we compare the bay segments against themselves, not against other bay segments. So Tomasko Bay is not supposed to look like the open part of Sarasota Bay, and the waters off of Wombo Key are not supposed to look like little Sarasota Bay. So each bay segment is not compared against the other ones. They're compared against what these bay segments were like during what we call our reference period. And our reference period is 2006 to 2012, because during those years, we had lower levels of nitrogen in the water, we had less macroalgae, and we had a 28% increase in seagrass coverage. And that's kind of like the canary in the coal mine. If you have a 28% increase in seagrass coverage, that doesn't happen unless you're a healthy system. So that's our kind of like, that's our target, what we want to get back to. So now let's look at our report card. And what we do is our report card has those 4 metrics, and they're comparing each bay segment against what it was like during that healthier time. And then we color code the results, because what really matters is not the number, but the pattern. The pattern will tell you whether or not you've got a problem or not. So the results are color coded. Blues and greens represent healthy conditions, the cooler colors. Yellow is caution, and red is stop. Something's going wrong. You need to figure out what's going on. So now let's look at our report card. The first 7 years were that reference period, mostly blues and greens, healthy conditions. The next 7 years is what we call the degraded period, but it's not degraded everywhere. So Tomasko Bay, well, first off, during this time period, 28% increase in seagrass. It was a healthier bay not that long ago, 10, 15 years ago, this was a healthier bay. Tomasko Bay continues to be healthy. The upper part of the bay was in its worst condition in 2018. 2018, if you remember what it was like in 2018, that big red tide, that red tide, if you were down in St. Armor Circle, there was nothing going on. There were flies everywhere, dead fish. We lost probably 2,000 acres of seagrass out there for that 1 year alone, and we probably lost 90% of the fish populations in this part of Sarasota Bay from that one red tide. That red tide was probably made worse by the fact that we released a huge volume of water out of Lake Okeechobee in response to Hurricane Irma, which happened in the fall of 2017. So we're releasing a whole lot of polluted water out of Lake Okeechobee. We create a big red tide, and then also this was by far the worst year for wastewater overflows in Sarasota Bay. So we made our own bay worse at the same time the red tide was really high because of big releases from Lake Okeechobee. So, but the more interesting thing is it starts to recover because this was a one-off. If we have another storm, something bad could happen, but we don't have the same problems that we had in the lower bay. So this lower bay stays yellow for years, and the lower bay, we got into the red category. 2018, 2019 was really bad. So the big thing that we looked at is, why was this time block worse than this time block? And the difference seems to be that our nitrogen loads were 20% higher during this time period than that time period. So we're adding more nutrients, we're creating worse water quality. So our preliminary load reduction goal was set in 2021. And what we said is we want to reduce the nutrient loads back to what it was when it's just a healthier bay.
Good question. Where's the lower bay?
I'm sorry?
Where is the lower bay?
So lower bay would be, say, from Ringling Boulevard all the way down to Venice Inlet. So this area through here. Yeah, and there's a couple of graphs here that are a little bit complicated. So I'm giving you the same presentation I'm giving Friday to an audience of planners and engineers, because I don't downgrade my talks. I just explain it. So if there's something you're not sure of, just raise your hand. I teach 2 nights a week, and the whole thing I try to get across to my students is there are no dumb questions, there are dumb silences. So if you don't know something, why would you know this? How would you know this beforehand? So if you got a question, I'm not explaining it, let me know. So we use a loading model, and it says that there are 2 loading sources in particular that if we act on them, should be enough to get us back to that water quality reduction target. So our water quality reduction target is 12 tons. 12 tons of inorganic nitrogen we want to get out of the bay. And what it tells us is that there's 3 times as much that we could act upon. So if we could act upon those 2 sources alone, reclaimed water is wastewater that is actually applied for irrigating lawns, that sort of thing, or baseball, softball, soccer fields, that sort of thing. We like reclaimed water, but when it has a high nutrient content, it's not a good idea, because it can overwhelm the assimilative capacity of the lawn, and now you got groundwater that can actually leak out and cause that problem. Spills and overflows, a big deal. So, but it says that we actually could act upon it, and the neat thing is, over the last 3 years, we've already met that load reduction target. So we're going to talk about how that was met, but we set the target in 2021, and it's already been met, which is actually pretty neat. So the rest of this talk is how good the recovery has been, and then we're going to end with the future challenges. So good news. And the good news is we're no longer impaired for nutrients. We set these targets 10 years ago. We exceeded them. We don't exceed them anymore. So in contrast to Tampa Bay or Charlotte Harbor, or any River Lagoon or Biscayne Bay, we are no longer out of compliance with the water quality targets that we ourselves set 10 years ago that we exceeded. So our water quality has improved enough that we are no longer considered impaired for nutrients, which is not a lot of people can say that, but we can. And this is the basis for it.
This is chlorophyllate. It's an indicator of how much algae is in the water, and you want low numbers. So look at that trend. They're all going down. Each one of those 4 base segments has a different target. But each one of those has met its target for the last 3 years. So our water quality is improving. It's not just my thought or my opinion. We have data. This is an independent assessment of what we've been saying. Our water quality is getting better, and because it's gotten better, we're no longer impaired. And some people might say, well, you're taking advantage of the drought. You know, if it didn't rain in 2023, you can't manage based on drought. 2023 is not in there. Our last year here is 2022, the year we had the hurricane. So 2023 is going to be even better water quality than the last year here. So we anticipate we're going to have 4 years in a row of really good water quality. So we don't think this is due to rainfall, because in all of Southwest Florida, there are only 10 water bodies that have actually come off of the impairment list, and we have 5 of them. If this was due to rainfall, we should have the same kind of results in Tampa Bay, Lone Bay, Charlotte Harbor. Yeah,
So is the seagrass getting better?
we're going to get there. That's about 3 slides from now. Absolutely. Yeah, that's a very good question, because that's what, the answer is yes. We just don't know the number yet. So we think that the recovery is not driven by rainfall because we're a hotspot. We're a statewide hotspot for improving water quality. And if it was rainfall, there should be a bunch of places, and there's not. There's about, so we are it. This is the most complicated graphic, so I'm going to take a little bit of time to walk you through this. So the first thing is the bottom axis, the x-axis. This is years. This is that reference period. This is that degraded period. This is the recovery period. These lines right here, do you agree that most of these spikes are occurring in that time period right there, that degraded period? You can see there's the pulse. So what those are indicators of how much nitrogen is in the water column, how much algae is in the water column, and how much red tide we have. They're all using different units. Some are milligrams per liter, some are micrograms per liter, some are cells per liter. So how do you display all of that on one graphic? So what we did is we used a technique where each one of these inflection points is a year, and we compare it to the average of the reference period in units of standard deviations. So if you know some stats, 1 standard deviation on the high end means 15% of the data should fit in there. So that means roughly 1 out of 8 years should be this high. And it's not 1 out of 8 years, it's basically all of the years. 2 standard deviations is very rare. That's something that should happen like maybe 1 out of every 30 years. And yet, we've got a bunch of these values are 2 standard deviations. What this means is things were in fact worse during this time period. So the nitrogen, the red tide, the amount of algae, all these things were worse during this degraded time period. And then notice how they all get better, except for this. This is red tide. And we think this value right there is because of the response after Hurricane Ian came through. It dropped about 15 inches of rain in the southern part of the bay. But these multiple indicators are that something was going wrong. So what was going wrong are these lines. So these lines right here are the volume of wastewater spills, and the units are on this side. 2E8 is scientific nomenclature for 200 million. So we had 1, 2, 3 wastewater spills, more than 200 million gallons of wastewater coming into our bay. We had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We had 5 wastewater spills of more than 100 million gallons. So in total, this graphic represents the sum of the wastewater overflows, and it hits basically 0, it tops out here because most of those wastewater overflows were done by 2020. That's 1 billion gallons of wastewater came into our bay. So the reason why our water quality got worse was wastewater. And our wastewater overflows were 1 billion gallons, which is a huge volume, but it's also not a very large percentage. So our wastewater treatment plants are dealing with like 12 million gallons a day. So the biggest wastewater treatment plant in our watershed in Sarasota County was responsible for these spills right here. But it deals with 12 million gallons a day. So what we're basically saying is during that 7 years, we did a good job of treating 95 to 97% of the wastewater, but that 3 to 5% that got spilled was enough to set us back and set us back about 20 years in terms of seagrass and water quality. So we did a great job with wastewater, but we didn't do a great job with 100% of it. So 3 to 5% of it was problematic. That was enough to give us the problems that we see all throughout this system. So worse water quality, then the spills stop because there's no more of these. we still have wastewater spills, but we're not seeing 100 million gallons. We're seeing like 1,000, 10,000, 5,000, something like that. And because we're no longer having spills, look how the water quality gets better. So this is telling us what we need to act on to get our bay better. Yes, ma'am.
So what caused the spills and what stopped the spills from being so significant?
We're going to talk about what made them better in a moment, but basically it was our wastewater infrastructure was just not up to the task. Everyone pays a lot of attention to the wastewater plant, but the pipes that lead to the plant might be 50, 70 years old, and some of them might be clay. So when it rains and the water seeps into the pipe, now there's more water delivered to the wastewater treatment plant than they can accommodate. And also it might have been that they were premature taking Siesta Key utilities offline. Siesta Key utilities comes to Bee Ridge. It rains, there's too much volume, they can't handle it. No one wants any more reclaimed water. They didn't have a wet weather storage capacity. They didn't have a deep well injection. So basically it just overflowed, spilled out into the bay. Reason why it's not happening anymore is because of the largest single capital improvement project in Sarasota County's history. $250 million project to expand and upgrade the largest wastewater treatment plant in our watershed.
Doctor, you talked about the wastewater, but what about the overflow or the continuing overflow from Lake Okeechobee? Which seems to be
Yeah.
very tight?
So when Lake Okeechobee discharges, which it's doing right now, if there's a red tide, it's going to make a worse red tide. If there's no red tide, it's not going to probably affect us too much. So what we do locally can make our red tides worse, like in 2018. Look how many spills we had in 2018. This is the worst year we had for red tide. This is our worst red tide in decades. It was also the worst year we had for wastewater overflows in this whole 20-some year period. So we make our own red tides worse. If we don't have red tide, then Lake Okeechobee probably isn't going to affect us a whole lot. But if we do have red tide anywhere around, it's going to make it a worse red tide. And then red tides move their way up the coast. Then when that happens, then they can explode if they get into our bay, especially if we've just loaded it with a couple 100 million gallons of wastewater. So we contributed to making this condition worse. Yes, ma'am.
What's on the graph, the other line that's going up?
This green one?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, that's the cumulative wastewater spills over time.
Oh, the cumulative.
So the point here is that it really ramps up in the middle part. And this is back when we had all the hundreds of people at Riverview High School complain about water quality, and rightfully so. But notice that it basically hits 100 back here because the total amount of wastewater spill that we had up to 2024 was already at 100% in the year 2020 because we're not doing it anymore. We don't have wastewater spills anymore. Yeah.
I want to ask, I don't really understand much of this, but anyway, why does Lake Okeechobee overflow?
That's a great question. So it's really, there's not a simple answer to that, but so what we've done in Florida for over 100 years is we've ditched and drained Florida effectively. So first for agriculture and now for housing. So do you know where Winter Haven is?
Yes.
So the average lake in Winter Haven is 4 feet lower than it was in the 1850s. Why are they lower? Because we lowered them. We connected the lakes to each other, and then the lowest elevation lake was connected to the Peace Creek Drainage Canal. So we lowered the landscape everywhere. So when it rains, the water doesn't soak into the ground anymore because we paved it over with houses and parking lots and driveways and that sort of stuff. It doesn't percolate into the ground, so it becomes stormwater runoff. We've increased the volume of water that goes down into Lake Okeechobee, but what a lot of people don't really realize as well is Lake Okeechobee is 7 feet lower than it was in the 1800s because we ditched and drained Lake Okeechobee. So we deliver all this water more quickly to Lake Okeechobee. It doesn't have the wet weather storage capacity because it's been lowered. So that water has to go somewhere. I'm a member of Captains for Clean Water. They want to send the water south, but you can't send it south because it's got too much phosphorus in it. And if you did that, you'd turn the Everglades into giant cattail marsh. There's a 10 parts per billion phosphorus limit. So the water can't stay in the lake because it's too low. It can't go to the south because it's too polluted, so it goes to the east and the west.
What are they doing about it?
Well, there's a lot of projects, but none of them are big enough. So there's a $500 million project called the C-43 Reservoir, and then there's also a big reservoir project that's going to be north of the lake. They're all good projects, they're just not big enough. And that's the problem that we don't have. So we're doing things that are big enough to make the difference, but they're doing things, but it's not big enough to make a difference. It's just that simple. I mean, they're doing good projects, but you wouldn't be able to tell that they're implemented because they're just not large enough. So you have a big ribbon cutting because it's a $500 million project. The problem is you don't need a $500 million project. You need a $10 billion project. The cost of Everglades restoration is $10 billion. Nobody is ponying up enough money to make the difference. Yeah.
So I was recently at a talk for the, what you call the captains for.
Yeah, clean water, yeah.
Yeah, captains for clean water. And of course, they talk about the sugar plantations.
Yeah, Everglades agriculture area. Yeah.
Right. So
That used to be the big source of water quality, but it's not the biggest source now. That was the big problem that you had back, in the 80s and 90s. But right now, the biggest nutrient load is coming north of the lake, not south of the lake. So those sugarcane fields don't do the same kind of back pumping that they used to do. Now our biggest problems that we have is the water that comes into the lake from the north, not from the south. So they're a little bit outdated on that. So depressing, but yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I'm not exactly sure what this was, but there was that plant leak. Up in.
Tiny Point.
near Tampa.
Oh, Tiny Point. Yeah.
Yeah, how did that affect the bay? Did that?
That was terrible. That was the worst thing to happen in 50 years. But it didn't affect all parts of the bay. The worst, it did affect, that was 200 million gallons, which is a lot, but it had a nutrient concentration 10 times more than the worst wastewater treatment plant in our watershed. So that was equivalent of adding 80,000 bags of fertilizer to Tampa Bay in 10 days. And if you remember what it was like in May and June of 2022, I think that was when if you went up to the northern part, Anna Maria Sound, it looked horrible. And one of the problems we had is it caused a different type of algal bloom than what is normally seen from aerial photography and all that. And we were out there collecting algal samples, and remember it smelled really, really, really bad. That is because when that type of algae decomposes, it releases things called putrescine. No lie, that's the compound, putrescine and cadaverine. Guess what they sound like? It smelled like rotting mammals, even though it's rotting seaweed. And that's really bad. It was bad for, if dogs ate it, it could die because it causes contact dermatitis. And so if a dog eats it, horses eat it, it can kill a horse, it can kill a dog. It was really bad to swim through, but we collected a lot of data, and it definitely affected Sarasota Bay, at least in the upper parts, more in Anna Maria Sound than here. But Holmes Beach looked horrible after that. Absolutely. All right. So this is the hardest graph. So if you got through that, you're good to go. All right. So this is why our bay is getting better. This isn't like a wish list. This is already done. This is already done. This is already done. This is in the middle of being done. This is the largest capital improvement project in Sarasota County's history. And basically, this is $300 million worth of infrastructure projects. It's not a wish list. This is actually being done. The upgrades to the Bee Ridge wastewater treatment plant have effectively stopped those overflows. So they're going to go to the highest level of nutrient removal. And as opposed to the city of Tampa, they're not going to have a surface discharge. So they're going to treat their wastewater as good as that can be done. Disney does the best job probably on the planet of wastewater. Their wastewater treatment plant produces effluent that looks like rainfall, and then 80% of it's used. That's why Disney looks green. Florida doesn't look green naturally because it stops raining for 8 months. But they do a fantastic job, and they're going to be very close to the Disney level. So we're seeing some really good news. And seagrass. The reason why we're psyched about it is this is a picture taken just out there, and this is an area where we've got seagrass. Can you guys see that? Is it light up?
Yeah.
So this seagrass picture is about 6 to 7 feet, and this area did not have seagrass a couple of years ago. It came back on its own. We're not planting it. We're not putting clams and oysters. We are, but this came back on its own because the water quality got better because we got our control of our water quality pollution sources. And this is our colleague from the Water Management District snorkeling over because they do the mapping of the seagrasses. So see this light area right here? See the dark area around there? That's a fisheye lens. This is all new seagrass meadow. It all came back on its own when the water quality got better because the pollutants came under control. And this is the kind of habitat that gives rise to these guys. Anybody know what these are? Juvenile gag grouper. If you like to eat grouper, you catch them out in the Gulf of Mexico. That's not where they spend the early parts of their life cycle. They spend the early life cycle in Sarasota Bay and Tampa Bay. So if we lose our estuaries, you're gonna lose your offshore grouper fishery, because that's the nursery ground for these guys out in the Gulf of Mexico. All right, so good news, but we want to be prepared for the next 30 years, because I've been doing this for 30 years. I didn't think I thought I was gonna die before I was 40, frankly. I want to take better care of myself. But, you know, what we're trying to do is we're trying to prepare ourselves for the next 30 years. And one of the things we're gonna see is this stuff. This is Longboat Key Village. This is what we call blue sky flooding. This isn't a rough day in the bay. It's not rainfall. This is the water in Sarasota Bay coming up into the streets. It's not several feet of water, but it's several inches. So it's not nothing. And the reason why this is happening is because our sea level has come up. This is monthly sea level data from the St. Pete gauge. And this red line is the best fit equation. And this is 6 inches over 20 years. The average long-term is an inch a decade. Over the last 5,000 years, we probably averaged about an inch a decade. We're now 3 inches a decade. We anticipate that's going to continue probably at the next 30 years. Our tidal range is 18 inches. So what this means is in the year 2050, the average sea level will be what today's high tide is. And the average high tide will be 9 inches stacked on top of that. That's not several feet of water, but it's not nothing. And so what we're trying to tell people is to be ready to be responding to this, because the folks in Longboat Key Village tell me that their streets flood twice a month, twice a month. Full moons and new moons give you spring tides. Spring tide is not anything to do with the year, it has to do with the time of the month. So spring tides, full moons and new moons give you street flooding in Longboat Key Village. That's what people tell us in that system. So we have to be prepared for that. This is the best example I know. This is Bradenton's Riverview Boulevard at 22nd Street. Go there on a high tide during a full moon, or right now we have a new moon, pretty much a new moon. And you will see this. This is no rain. This is not a rough day. You see that little pulse of water? That's Manatee River coming into the streets. This is not a canal, this is a street. And there are people that drive down this, don't know, this is salt water. This is bad for your car. It's also bad for real estate, because believe me, these houses are not selling for top dollar. So this is the kind of thing that's going to happen more and more over the next couple of years.
And there's nowhere they can go. It drains. Where does it drain?
It doesn't.
Dries.
Yeah, you have to wait for the tide to go down.
Yeah.
So the roads basically fill with water until the tide drops down.
Wow.
This is not the worst case. Florida's worst case is probably north side of Key Largo. This is the main reason why it's happening. This isn't green. This is thermal expansion. The same reason why a hot air balloon goes up in the air. Our water's getting warm because our air is getting warmer. So this is a neat graphic that shows they took the average air temperature for 100 years, 1900 to the year 2000, and then they calculated the average for each month. And then they take each month and they compare it to that average. If you're exactly the average, you're clear. If you're cooler, you're blue, that becomes darker blue. And if you're warmer, it's yellow, it becomes brown. So in this first, 100 years, lots of blues and greens and clear boxes. Look at the last couple of decades. It is warmer than it used to be. It's warmer than it has been the last century. It's not tremendously warmer, but we used to average 2 to 3 freezing temperatures a year in Sarasota. When's the last time you had a freezing temperature? So if you've lived here a long time, remember how you had the dedicated sheets that you used to put on top of your landscaping, right? When's the last time you did that? Because I remember what ours were like. They were like these hideous kind of sheets that we had when our daughter was little, and we would put them out to protect our vegetation. I can't remember the last time we did it, because it is not getting that cold anymore. We've had 3 freezes in the last 10 years. We used to average 2 to 3 a year. We used to start off August days in the 60s. So we haven't had a single hour of a single day in 20 years where we had an August day that was less than 70 degrees. So not every day was in the 60s, but we haven't had a single hour of any day in August for 20 years where it's been cooler than 70 degrees. So it is getting warmer. That's making the air warmer, the water's warmer, and that's what's giving us the sea level rise we're seeing so far. So the scary part about this is, why worry about warm water and warm air? Because it's fuel for hurricanes. And a hurricane is a heat engine. So what do we mean by heat engine? Engines take one form of energy and turn it into another. Your car takes, like hydrocarbons, turns into mechanical energy. Hurricanes take thermal energy from warm, moist air and warm water, and they turn to mechanical energy. But their mechanical energy is wind and waves. So we've got a data set that goes back to before the Civil War.
And the red line is the 5-point moving average. So there's some in the North Atlantic Basin, some evidence of increased tropical storms. But the more important part is this is the number of major hurricanes, 3 and higher. The first half of this data set, look how many zeros there were. We had a lot of years where we'd have a hurricane, but it wasn't a major one. Now, it's very rare that we don't have a major hurricane. Hurricane Michael in 2019 went from a tropical storm to Category 5 in 3 days. And it hit Mexico Beach. Remember the pictures of Mexico Beach? That was a tropical storm 3 days earlier than that. And that freaked a lot of people out. Hurricane Otis, look this one up. That's when it hit Acapulco. It went from a tropical storm to Category 5 in 13 hours. No one anticipated that. You know the spaghetti models we talk about? The spaghetti models have 2 components, where it's going to land and how strong it's going to be. None of the models predicted it to be anything but a tropical storm. And it became a Category 5 in less than 24 hours because it hit a patch of water that was 88 degrees, which is incredibly warm for the Eastern Pacific. If you ever swim off of San Diego or LA, you know it's not warm water. Well, it's warm now. So 88 degrees is cool compared to what we get in the Gulf of Mexico. We have bay temperatures that are more than 95 degrees. So the ability of a hurricane to really blow up very quickly is now realized. So this is what Hurricane Ian did to Sarasota Bay. So this was shot in September of 2022, and this was shot after Ian came through a couple of days afterwards. So notice the difference in water quality. This looks like root beer. It did not smell like root beer. It smelled like dead fish and compost, because that's what it was. We had no oxygen in the bottom water of this part of the bay, and so all the fish died. So this is what happens when a hurricane drops that much rainfall. It creates a big pulse of nutrients that comes in, that triggers algal blooms, that brings with it a whole lot of porta potties. Like if you went down to like Northport, you saw porta potties tipped over all over the place. Anytime there's a job site, right, that you'll have construction crews, you can have a porta potty. Porta potties are very top heavy, apparently. And they tipped over all over the place. And porta potties float, by the way. So porta potties were floating down the streets, just spilling their contents all over the place. All over in Northport. So yeah, it's not a, next time you have a hurricane, don't rush out. It's important, because there were about 70, 80 people that died of bacterial infections, not necessarily due to the storm alone, but it was a very high year for people who died of Vibrio vulnificus, particularly in Lee County, which is the epicenter of where that storm hit. So the reason why we make this link is because a cleaner bay is a more resilient bay. Yeah, a hurricane will damage us, but it'll be a lot less of an impact than if it hit the inner lagoon, because we're a healthier, more resilient system than we used to be. So what we do will help us, regardless of whether we have a red tide, regardless of whether we have a hurricane, it'll be a cleaner bay, but it'll be better if we do have a red tide, it'll be better if we have a hurricane. And then I'll end with a couple of neat slides, which is, it's not just about water quality, it's also about physically manipulating the landscape, and it's also about public outreach. So we are spending $4.5 million on habitat restoration projects that we got through the federal government through the infrastructure law. All that $4.5 million is being spent on projects. None of it's being spent on salary or our lush office spaces. It's all being spent. My office chair is held together with duct tape. But we do a good job of restoration projects. So this is the last one we completed. And some of you guys were there. I think Mike was here for that. So this is the Florida Institute for Saltwater Heritage. And this is the conceptual design of the restoration project. It's phase 4, because this is earlier phases. This used to be like a garbage dump, an informal garbage dump. And now it's a salt marsh, and with mangroves coming in. And there's fish that swim in this area. And our effort was in that area right through there, where we created these nice tidal creeks. So if you go out on Manatee Avenue, and it's just east of Cortez, you'll see this big cleared area on the right-hand side. That's our project. So it's a really neat one. We've got plants, actually, some of them are doing really well, some of them aren't. This El Nino winter is probably pretty good for most of them, but we do need to plant a few more areas. But we're taking the stormwater runoff from that 20, 30 acre RV park, and now it's being treated. It was just going out into the bay untreated. Now it's being treated through the restoration project we've done. We got a big restoration project in the city of Bradenton, where we're going to do reclaiming and restoring this tidal creek. Excuse me, it's not a tidal creek, it's just a freshwater stream in GT Bray Park. We've started on that already. This is actually a pond. You can't see it's a pond, but it's a pond. And we got rid of all the exotic vegetation, killed all the exotic and nuisance vegetation. It looks kind of bad now, but it's supposed to look bad because they're trying to kill bad plants. And we're gonna keep killing bad plants for a year, and then we're gonna put in the good plants. So this will be a neat little project. And then we're kickstarting an artificial reef program. We haven't put an artificial reef out in the bay in like about 10 years, and we're gonna be putting out 24 of them. And we've used the scientific studies to figure out which is the best type of artificial reef to put out there, and it's this guy right here. This produces juvenile gag grouper and mangrove snapper. The other ones do a good job of, getting you a sheep's head, which is fine, but we don't have a shortage of sheep's head. We want more gag grouper, we want more mangrove snapper, and this is the type of reef we're gonna put out there. And we're gonna be putting them out in 6 locations, so 24 reef modules go out in 6 locations. A big project that we're waiting to finalize is MLK Park on the corner of Coconut and MLK Drive. And we worked with the local community to figure out what they wanted. And we're going to be putting in what's called a living shoreline and these kind of like easier access. So right now it's like there's a chain and a link fence, and then it drops off 4 feet into the water. And there's a disconnect. No one enjoys going on that part. This is what the community told us they wanted, so this is what we're going to be designing for, is this type of restoration project. And then the last part, because I can't forget this, we dish out $100,000 a year in grants through the Bay Partners grants. I think you guys are applying for one. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
I have no idea. I'm not on the selection committee, but we do fund lots of projects with that. Removing exotic vegetation, all sorts of public education aspects. We sponsor the Bay Fest, and this last Bay Fest we had 100,000. We had 1,000 people at Bay Fest, and take people out there to show them the bay. And look how beautiful this bay is. Look at all the grass beds that are coming back in that area. We did not have that much grass a couple of years ago. This is a city island park on Lido Key. We also have one gentleman that we're funding who does kayak tours, and he does kayak tours that we're paying for to take veterans with diagnosed PTSD out, on the bay to, kind of like a healing kind of a moment exercise for them, which they really like. And we pay a particular attention to Title I schools. Title I schools are where the families are poor enough that 40% of the student population qualifies for free lunch. So we take a lot of effort into that. This is, I think, Booker Middle School. And we've brought 1,000 kids out to the bay that wouldn't necessarily come out to the bay. They might not be anyone in their family, in their neighborhood, who ever has thought of being a marine scientist. Well, we want them to be able to think of that as a potential career path. So we brought 1,000 kids from Title I schools out, working with our great partners at Boat Marine Lab. And we're starting a mentoring program where we take people from some of these high schools and show them what's a day in the life of a marine biologist or a planner, an engineer, an architect like. And then we do the traditional cleanup effort. And we did this one. Are you in this photo?
Yeah, grimy and dirty and stinky.
There you are. So we do habitat restoration projects. We also do a lot of cleanups. We did a cleanup project before our Citizens Advisory Committee meeting, which probably was not a good idea because it was a small little room and everyone smelled like mangroves. But we collected a lot of trash, as you can see right through here. And we also fund the volunteer group. This is Suncoast Reef Rovers that collects trash off the artificial reefs in places like Venice Inlet. And then one of the last things, vertical oyster gardens. So if you've got a dock, a marina, you don't need a permit to put a vertical oyster garden out underneath that. And if you can put it out yourself, you can get them for free. We'll contact us and we'll get you in touch with them. If you can't put them out yourself, we even have people who do it for you. So we work with local restaurants to collect their oyster shell. And then we have like school groups. And actually this guy right here, Dom Marino, there he is. He's actually the director of an assisted living facility down in South Sarasota County. And he has like old people, at their assisted living facility making vertical oyster gardens. And so we have like both ends of the age spectrum making these little things, put them out underneath your dock. If you've got a marina here, put more of these things out. And after summer spawning season, they're going to be covered with oysters. I put out 50 of them myself. And we actually also have a partnership. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Does it matter how your tide levels?
You want them to be in the intertidal zone, so you don't want them hanging in the air. oysters aren't gonna be there.
If your water goes down,
That's fine, yeah.
it doesn't matter.
Yeah, it's only gonna,
Part of the
it's
day.
about 18 inches tidal range here, so as long as they're kind of like, within that tidal range, they'll be fine, but if they touch the bottom, you need a permit. So don't let them touch the bottom. Seriously. And we also have a local business on Siesta Key that is donating some portion of their profits on this one clothing line to Vertical Oyster Gardens. And Mike was on the call today where they've given us $600 to put Vertical Oyster Gardens out in the Bay Park Conservancy. And then 2 last slides. End of the day, this is Sarasota Bay left. That's Indian Lagoon on the right. Where do you want to swim? Where do you want to own a house? And where do you want to bring your grandkids and your kids out on the bay? And so if you don't want to end up like that, then we need to do a better job, not only now, but into the future. And this is not picking on Indian Lagoon. They don't want to be that way. So if we don't want to be that way, we have to keep doing the things we've been doing. So last slide, if you want to follow us, SarasotaBay.org, follow us on social media, or point your phone at this QR code, and it'll take you to the ArcGIS story map version of our management plan. That's all I got. Yes, ma'am.
Besides the vertical garden, what else can we actually take away that we can do?
Yeah, great thing. So what we talk about is like reducing your own personal nutrient pollution footprint. So you don't have reclaimed water here, I don't believe, right? So if that's the case, just make sure that when you mow your lawn or whoever does lawn maintenance, that they don't blow grass clippings out into the bay. They don't over fertilize. So do they know how much fertilizer application they are putting out? It shouldn't be more than like 10 pounds per 1,000 square feet per year, something like that. If they fertilize in the wet street, I'm sorry. Yeah, and I think if I'm correct, everyone who has a lawn maintenance license has to go through a training program here. So Lawn Key, you shouldn't have a problem with your lawn maintenance because they have to be licensed according to guidance that Lawn Key has developed. So that's number one. Pick up after your pets. If you have a concrete seawall and you replace it with a plastic seawall, you're going to lose your oysters. So if that happens, put out more vertical oyster gardens, because that's one thing we're seeing all over the place is concrete seawalls being replaced with vinyl or fiberglass seawalls, and the oysters just don't grow on them. And that's losing a lot of oyster habitat. And if you live on the water, you're the first people going to be adversely impacted by bad water quality. So substitute vertical oyster gardens for more oysters on your seawall, if you would. And vote for people like Mike. He's been a really good supporter of the program, and literally we're spending $300 million, and I've had zero pushback because the public understands the need for this bay not look like they really good. And I think most politicians here get it, but not every politician in Florida understands how important water quality is to our economic future. Because there are a lot of places in Florida where it's just not going very well. Indian Lagoon is kind of collapsing. Florida coral reef tract, anyone dove on it? There's no coral reef left. We have corals. We don't have a coral reef left. We're down 90–95% of coral reef. So if you never dove on the Florida Keys reef tract, it's too late. Which is kind of sad, but that's the way it is. Listen.
Especially by the time the water, what should we do or not do to protect the seabirds?
Well, that's good. So I've been a boater for 40 years. So stay in your channel, know your water depth, run aground, stop your motor, tilt your motor up, pull yourself off. If you can't pull yourself off, then wait for the tide to change and then pull yourself off. We're called sea tow. So don't create the prop scars. Watch where you anchor, that you don't pick up a whole bunch of grass. I mean, an anchor or two is not a problem, but we've got thousands of boats out there every weekend. So cumulatively, prop scars and anchors are an issue. But for the most part, we encourage people to get out on the water because people have to pay our bills for people who are living here, and we want them to enjoy the bay. We don't want them to be scared of it. We want them to be out there and enjoying it. I cause damage every time I go out, to some degree, I might, be tromping through a grass bed chasing after something, and so, but we, cumulatively, I think it's not as important as what was happening with Honey Point and with Caloosahatchee fueled red tide and what we had happen in 2018. So our water quality is much better. We spend a lot of time in the bay, it's better. So we're doing a pretty good job, even though we have more people. Yes, ma'am.
Does dredging change the problem?
It can. Dredging canals can be an issue if they're not appropriate, like silk curtains put in place. And if there's grass in the bottom of a canal, for example, you have to mitigate for it, you have to replace it somewhere. The dredging can be a problem, but, it's also something that can be controlled. It can have minimal input or it can have horrible input. For the most part, dredging right now is done in a pretty safe manner, I think.
And you may not know, but we have a dredging program that we're studying right now. And probably in the next year, we'll start a pre-massive dredging around Longwood Key. But the permit requires that if we damage any seagrass, we have to replant it.
And probably at like a 2 to 3 to 1 ratio.
Yeah, so we'll have a permit, how to.
And we've talked to Longwood Key as well. So they're replacing the pipeline, the wastewater pipeline going from.
Yeah, well, we almost got the funding done. It'll probably be next year or two as we'll start. We've got the permit. We're doing the engineering right now.
Okay, the permit, excellent.
And that's a $25-30 million project.
And that's a really good example of like proactive, because that pipeline had, use the right language. It was a leak. It was a leak. It wasn't a spill, it was a leak.
So the pipeline was laying on top of an old log.
Yeah.
And over 40 years, it wore old.
Yeah.
Luckily, it was on land, not out in the middle of the Gulf or the middle of the bay where it caused a lot of damage.
It's a couple hundred feet into a mangrove fringe over on Manatee County shoreline, and that's a good reason why mangroves are important. I was in the private sector at the time. We got a phone call about this. We set up a monitoring program. We never found elevated bacteria at all, and that was over 10 million gallons of raw wastewater because it was filtered through the mangrove.
Mangroves love it.
Mangroves, yeah, they grow in it, and so that's a good reason to protect the mangrove fringe, because we had 10 million gallons of raw sewage. We couldn't find bacteria in the bay. But if that was a leak that happened underneath bay, that would have been a disaster. That was right before 4th of July, if I remember correctly. Exciting time. Yeah, her and then you. Sorry.
Well, when you showed the manatees, the baby manatees.
Yeah.
And the mothers had died, wasn't there a project where they were trying to feed the manatees?
Yeah.
How did that ever work out?
Well, I mean, it worked. They're feeding them romaine lettuce, and they're trying to like hide so the manatees don't associate it with humans. But if you talk to people who are doing it, it's off of the dock, and so the manatees hear people walking down the aluminum dock, and they know it's lunchtime. And so they are associating getting fed with humans walking on docks. So it probably is not a good thing. You don't go to like, Serengeti and like hand feed elephants. That'll change their behavior, but that's what we're doing. But we're doing that because it was just awful optics of seeing so many people die. I mean, literally, Brevard County is the epicenter of the die-off. And I used to live on the inner river in Brevard County. It was beautiful back in the 80s, and it's awful now. So they had to do that because there's really nothing else they could do. But it's not like we've solved the problem. It's still a very polluted water body. The grasses haven't come back. And we now have a generation of manatees that don't know what to do. They don't know where to go. They don't have their moms to follow to know where to go when it gets cold and where to go when it gets warm. They just don't know what to do. They're in a pool in SeaWorld. And what are we going to do when we release them? A manatee is not just going to glom on to like the next manatee. They hang by their moms, and now they're not. They don't know what to do. So it's a bigger impact than people think.
We have time for one more question.
Oh yeah, okay.
I think this.
And I can hang out afterwards.
This might be a question for Mike. Is that? Yes. How do you replant seagrass?
Maybe you
I wouldn't.
Technically, I don't know.
I wouldn't. I think it's a waste of time. If there's a physical impact, if there's a canal that needs to be dredged, do it. But we expect to see like 800 acres of seagrass, and that increase we saw, we didn't plant it. It came back on its own because the seed bank was still there.
So we're required to find a place to plant it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, how do you physically do it? You swim down.
Oh, yeah.
Price?
Yeah, just have a scuba tank and a couple of things so people can pin down there. I'm sorry, yeah. In the event of like a physical disturbance, like dredging, it makes a lot of sense. But what doesn't make sense is something that came down from Tallahassee, which is like $5 million to plant seagrasses all around the state of Florida. Why? Honestly, it just doesn't make sense. 100 acres is nothing statewide. We've lost 180 square miles of seagrass in the last 20 years in Florida. So we're planting 100 acres. There's 640 acres in a square mile. We've lost 180. So we need to get our water quality under control. And they'll come back.
Maybe explain why the seagrass died.
Yeah, so if the water's not clear enough, if you don't get enough light penetration, it's like putting a tomato plant in a closet. You know, if they don't have light, then they're gonna die. So we maintain water clarity and we're gonna be good. And so we're seeing that recovery of seagrass you asked about earlier because our water quality is under control, because our pollutant loads are under control.
Dave, thank you for your leadership.
Yeah, and I can hang around after, yeah, no worries.
Thank you.
Thanks for.